Hello, I'm James Myers, host of Plato's Pod. As the world turns a page on the tumultuous year that was 2025 and aims for better things in 2026, in this episode I want to talk about something that dominates the news, drives much economic activity, and is shaping our lives. The subject of this episode is artificial intelligence, and you might wonder what such a modern concern has to do with Plato's writing 2,400 years ago. I'm going to compare our modern concept of machine intelligence to the logic of Plato's characters, who tell us that intelligence develops only in the soul and nowhere else. I'll begin by discussing Plato's revolutionary conception of the soul, and I'll invite different thinking about the powerful technology that we're creating. I'll suggest that we stop calling it intelligence, because intelligence is a unique power of the soul in us. Intelligence is neither artificial nor algorithmic, as I'll explain using the logic of Plato's characters. At the outset, it's worth recalling how the term artificial intelligence came to be in the first place. When it was first used 66 years ago, it was a promotional gimmick that John Connolly employed in a funding application for what he had originally planned to call automata studies. An automaton is a robot, and the word automaton sounds very limiting. After all, there's only so much a robot can do, so Connolly came up with the idea of calling it artificial intelligence. The word intelligence is certainly more attention-grabbing than automaton, and as it turned out, Connolly received the funding for his research in 1956. Shortened to the acronym AI, artificial intelligence is now being heavily marketed to replace human labor and generate profits for technology companies and the billionaires who control them. So now that we're stuck with the term artificial intelligence nearly 7 decades later, we might pause to ask, what is intelligence? The intelligent world hasn't answered that fundamental question about itself, although big tech companies are racing to be the first to create an intelligence more powerful than any human, in whichever way the tech leaders define intelligence in their quest for profit. The question that requires an intelligent answer is this: what is it, specifically, that makes us intelligent? We do call ourselves intelligent beings, don't we? Why? For what reasons? Let's begin by considering a fundamental difference between humans and machines, which is that humans have souls and machines don't. I'll explain more fully what is meant by the word soul, but for the moment rest assured that I'm not referring to an object of religion or a matter of belief. If the word soul conjures up these connotations, think of it instead as the force in your mind that animates you. Surely each one of us possesses some such force, whatever we choose to call it, that makes us unique individuals. Plato's presentation of the soul as something that never dies has long been controversial, and many people believe that when the body dies, anything like a soul that's housed in the body also perishes. I won't argue that point directly, but instead I'll focus on Plato's truly revolutionary conception of the soul. If we were to conceive of the soul according to the logic of Plato's characters, it could fundamentally change science, and in particular modern physics. The idea is that long before anything physical existed in this universe, before the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, there existed a soul. The idea is that the soul isn't limited to our human being, it's that the universe itself has a soul. If we accept this conception, it would mean that the soul of the universe is woven into the physical fabric of space and time that erupted in the Big Bang. Further, it would mean that the soul is the cause of the Big Bang, and that it was the universal soul that gave birth to the physical universe. It's common, especially in modern science, to think the other way around, that the physical universe came first, and somehow vast numbers of particles of physical matter created human souls much later in time. The Platonic conception, however, means that the soul is not an invention of nature, but the opposite, that the soul is the source of nature. As the unnamed Athenian in Plato's Laws states, the idea is that the soul is preeminently natural. In this episode, I'll explore the implications of a soul that's far older than anything physical in this universe, of a soul that created physics, as Plato's characters describe the soul in other dialogues such as the Timaeus and the Philebus. We don't know Plato's own opinions on the soul or any other question, because he famously wrote in his 7th letter that he had never, nor would he ever, express his own opinions. What we can clearly see, however, is Plato's concern that we should appreciate the power of what's inside every one of us, which he called the soul. In my talk today, I'll combine perspectives on the soul that appear in 10 of Plato's dialogues, specifically the Laws, the Republic, the Timaeus, the Theaetetus, the Sophist, the Phaedrus, the Meno, the Phaedo, the Philebus, and the Parmenides. With the combined perspective on soul that emerges from these dialogues written 2,400 years ago, I'm going to propose something that could be very helpful and empowering for our difficult relationship with the technology that we call artificial intelligence. First, though, let me say a few things about the word soul, because soul is the primary subject throughout Plato's works. In fact, the words soul and the plural souls appear over 1,200 times in the collected volume of Plato's works entitled Plato, Complete Works, which was published in 1997 and is the source of the quotes that I'll use throughout this episode. Some people think that the word soul has only a religious meaning. Of course, Plato and Socrates lived hundreds of years before the major religions of today were established, and so the word soul in Plato's writing doesn't necessarily equate with the way the word is now used in the context of organized religions. Organized religion doesn't feature in Plato's writing, and although Plato refers to God many times in his dialogues, his is a different conception of God than we normally encounter these days. A sizable proportion of people now think that God doesn't exist, and many others who do believe in the existence of God disagree on God's nature. Perhaps some common understanding for Plato's use of the word God and soul can be had if we substitute the word universe for God on the basis that both imply everything and all powerful. I think we can all agree that the universe exists, and accepting that universe and God refer to fundamentally the same thing could cast a different light, for example, on Book 10 of Plato's Laws. There, at 885b, the Athenian states that the gods are not, quote, influenced by sacrifices and supplications, unquote, and cannot, quote, easily be won over, unquote. In other words, the Athenian is saying that the power of the universe doesn't bend unjustly to favor any one of us. And that's because the universe has no regard for the material wealth or displays of contrition by people whose souls are motivated by injustice. Thinking of the universe this way, regardless of one's views on God or religion, perhaps we can take comfort in the idea that the universe is just and is geared for justice. The soul that Plato wrote about is not a religious object, and the word soul isn't the exclusive property of religion. The soul that's the abiding concern of Plato's collected works refers to the animating force in us, something in our minds that's unseeable, but which drives our actions and makes us each a unique, self-motivated individual. In the Platonic conception, self-motivation, as I'll discuss shortly, is a fundamental property of the soul. If there's any purpose in life, surely it can't be found in the notion that our actions are not self-motivated and are instead a product of physics, or that the chemical and electrical reactions in our brain determine our actions, or that our actions are predestined, or that what we do is controlled by a God that's somehow alien from our being. I'll take here what I think is the only reasonable position for living, which is that there is purpose in life, that each of us creates purpose with our lives, and our creative purpose means that each of us has the power of self-animation to determine our own actions. Your animating force, which I'll call your soul, is different from my soul. That force gives us each the ability to examine our own lives, and self-examination makes life worth living, as Socrates states in the Apology at 38a. The force of soul is what makes us unique individuals with our own thoughts, motivations, and actions. We are not puppets of an alien god. Rather, our bodies and souls are all unquestionably part of the same universe in which we're individually enabled to act, and our actions are guided by our souls that emerge not from physics, but from the goodness of the universal soul. Understanding the word soul this way, it's difficult to define exactly what soul is. And maybe that's because soul is actually a bit of everything. As Socrates says at 246a of Plato's Phaedrus, to describe what the soul actually is would require a very long account, altogether a task for a god in every way. But to say what it is like is humanly possible and takes less time. So let us do the second in our speech. Socrates then proceeds with his famous analogy of the soul as the charioteer that drives two horses. One of the horses is beautiful and good, while the other horse is its opposite. And I think we've all experienced that contrast at least once in our lives. As he talks about the soul's task of driving us on the best path among our sometimes conflicting needs and desires, Socrates concludes, "This means that chariot driving in our case is inevitably a painfully difficult business." Personally, I can vouch for Socrates' conclusion, and I suspect that from lived experience, we can all agree with it. It's clear to witness that reasoning, creative souls are essential for human living and make us fundamentally different from algorithmically driven robots. At the outset, I asked why we think of ourselves as intelligent beings, and I'll ask here whether self-motivation is fundamental to whatever reason we have for calling ourselves intelligent. But when Plato's characters go a step further to say that the universe itself has a soul, they mean that the soul in each of us is not alone, not simply another part of our physics that lives and dies with the physical body. They mean that our souls are part of the universal soul, which is an idea that I find to be incredibly empowering for human potential. That we should have such a connection to the source of everything, to the universal cause, is especially meaningful in this time when so called artificial intelligence is widely expected to be capable of exceeding human intelligence. I'll explain why I think a universal soul is a particularly helpful concept in the struggle to sort out our relationship with a remarkably powerful technology that we mislabel as artificial intelligence, because the intelligence of the soul is something very different. Using the logic of Plato's characters, I'll explain why intelligence is the exclusive property of the soul and not something that can be constructed or programmed. Of course, we don't have any soul detecting technologies, and so many will say that without empirical proof, there is no universal soul and no point in discussing the matter further. But consider the logic that's inherent in the word universe in relation to our human being, which is what Socrates does at Philebus 30a to b. He begins by asking for confirmation of our self-motivating force with the question, of the body that belongs to us, will we not say that it has a soul? His interlocutor Protarchus responds, quite obviously that is what we will say. Socrates continues to inquire into the source and cause of our self-motivating force by asking, but where does it come from? Unless the body of the universe, which has the same properties as ours but more beautiful in all respects, happens to possess a soul. Modern science has yet to provide an answer to the question that Socrates asked 2,400 years ago. I'd offer another formulation of Socrates' question with the same logical conclusion. If you and I have a soul, then does it not stand to reason that the universe, which by definition comprises everything, would also have a soul? Otherwise, how is it that you and I could have something that the universe doesn't also have? Imagining that we are random existences in one of many universes won't address the question of Socrates. While the word universe derives from the Latin universum, meaning all things, everybody, all people, the whole world, some scientists argue that there is not one universe. Instead, they argue for what they call a multiverse that consists of many different constructions of physics other than the particular construction that we experience. That argument, however, begs the question that if there is a multiverse, then of what, exactly, is it a multitude? A multiple necessarily requires one thing on which the multiple is based. So what's the one thing that would give rise to a multitude of universes? The answer brings us back to the universe as the one thing of which there would be multiples. In the Timaeus at 31a to b, the title character dispenses with the idea of a multiverse and asserts that there is one all-encompassing universe. Timaeus asks the question, have we been correct in speaking of one universe, or would it have been more correct to say that there are many, in fact infinitely many universes? In answering his own question, Timaeus calls the universe itself a living thing, that's with a capital L and a capital T for emphasis, which is quite different from many modern scientific conceptions of the universe as an inert physical object that somehow happens to have generated, long after it exploded in the Big Bang, living beings like ourselves who happen to possess souls. Applying some mathematical logic, Timaeus states, quote, there is but one universe, if it is to have been crafted after its model. For that which contains all of the intelligible living things could never be one of a pair, since that would require there to be yet another living thing, the one that contained those two, of which they would then be parts. And then it would be more correct to speak of our universe as made in the likeness, now not of those two, but of that other, the one that contains them. So, in order that this living thing could be like the complete living thing in respect of uniqueness, the Maker made neither two nor yet an infinite number of worlds. On the contrary, our universe came to be as the one and only thing of its kind, is so now, and will continue to be so in the future. Here the logic of Timaeus is especially compelling. Otherwise, science would have to account for an infinite regress of universes, each one existing as an effect without a cause. Modern science is rooted in the idea that things can't exist without a cause, so infinite regress isn't scientific. The universal soul of Plato's writing is that which brings order to the physical universe. It's not controversial to say that there is order in the physical universe because modern science has established that there are laws of physics and unbreakable universal constants like the speed of light, gravitation, the mass of an electron. These universal laws and constants are expressed mathematically in Einstein's field equations and many other ways. Mathematician Kurt Gödel, who is famous for his incompleteness theorems, Asked in a letter to his mother in 1961, does one have a reason to assume that the world is rationally organized? I think so, for it is absolutely not chaotic and arbitrary. Rather, as natural science demonstrates, there reigns in everything the greatest regularity and order. Order is, indeed, a form of rationality. We can also consider the words of physicist Werner Heisenberg, famous for his uncertainty principle of quantum mechanics, who stated, "I think that modern physics has definitely decided in favor of Plato. In fact, the smallest units of matter are not physical objects in the ordinary sense. They are forms, ideas that can be expressed unambiguously only in mathematical language." At 28d in Plato's Philebus, Socrates proposes investigating the question whether we hold the view that the universe and this whole world order are ruled by unreason and irregularity, as chance would have it, or whether they are not rather, as our forebears taught us, governed by reason and by order of a wonderful intelligence. The reasoning that follows in the dialogue between Socrates and the character Protarchus centers on several key arguments. One of these is that everything in the physical realm comes to be in combinations of the unlimited and the limited. As Socrates explains in the Philebus, the unlimited exists in the eternal, changeless, and timeless realm of being, whereas the limited exists in the realm of becoming, where physical things exist in a continual state of change and only for a limited period of time. Modern science has established that all physical things are subject to a limit in time by the second law of thermodynamics in a process called entropy, by which all things begin in a state of maximum order and over time end in a state of maximum disorder. Of course, our own lives and bodies are things that are limited in time, but within the limits of time, we are capable of developing great intelligence by the application of reason. When the mind exercises reason in the realm of being, we are able to connect the limits of physical things to the unlimitedness of the universe. Modern science has not established the initial cause of order in the physical universe. If the universe erupted in a fiery Big Bang, from what source did the physical universe obtain order in the aftermath of that fiery explosion? Surely order can't be the result of randomness, and in any event, science hasn't established any physical process that's purely random and therefore disconnected from any other process. It's an act of pure faith, which is not permitted in modern science, to think that something like an ordered physical universe emerged from nothing or from randomness. Modern science has not provided empirical proof of any physical thing that comes to be from nothing, and the science of physics is predicated on the existence of a cause for every physical thing. Plato's characters don't disagree. In fact, at Timaeus 28a, the title character states, "That which comes to be must come to be by the agency of some cause." The cause is the source of a physical thing, and as Socrates states at Phaedrus 245c, anything that has a beginning comes from some source. This speaks to the unresolved ongoing problem of modern physics. It's a problem of modern physics that Plato's 2,400-year-old dialogue, The Laws, addressed directly in questioning, quote, the initial principle, unquote, as the Athenian called it. The Athenians' question about the initial principle was made in the context of motion, of which there are many types. For instance, we can think of the Big Bang as a type of motion because motion involves change, and the Big Bang changed everything that followed it. In discussing 10 types of motion with the character Clinias in the Laws, at 894c, the Athenian asks, which of our roughly 10 motions should we be justified in singling out as the most powerful and radically effective? To which Clinias responds, we can't resist the conclusion that the motion which can generate itself is infinitely superior, and all the other motions are inferior to it. They proceed to discuss the order of change among the various types of motions, concluding that the very first of all changes that will ever occur in time was the change made by self-generating motion. In other words, by the universal soul. Motion provides the basis for understanding Plato's conception of the soul and the intelligence that resides in the soul. The connection of knowledge to motion is crucial, and science has established that everything in the physical universe, including our bodies, is always in motion. Even when we sit perfectly still, the Earth we're sitting on is rotating at an incredible speed. At the equator, the Earth rotates at 1,670 kilometers per hour, and the Earth orbits the Sun at the blazingly fast speed of 30 kilometers per second. It's a fundamental principle of physics that everything is in motion. The argument for the universal soul as a first principle for motion emerges from the following question of the Athenian. When we find one thing producing a change in another, and that in turn affecting something else, and so forth, will there ever be, in such a sequence, an original cause of change? How could anything whose motion is transmitted to it from something else be the first thing to effect an alteration? It's impossible. In reality, when something which has set itself moving effects an alteration in something, and that in turn affects something else, so that the motion is transmitted to thousands upon thousands of things one after another, the entire sequence of their movements must surely spring from some initial principle, which can hardly be anything except the change effected by self-generated motion. The Athenian goes on to state that self-generating motion has no, quote, antecedent impulse, unquote, meaning that it has no cause from any other source, which leads to his conclusion that, quote, self-generating motion, then, is the source of all motions, and the primary force in both stationary and moving objects, and we shan't be able to avoid the conclusion that it is the most ancient and the most potent of all changes, whereas the change which is produced by something else and is in turn transmitted to other objects comes second. A bit further on at 896a of the Laws, the Athenian asks, so what's the definition of the one thing we call the soul? Surely we can do nothing but use our formula of a moment ago, motion capable of moving itself. And Clinias responds with a conclusion in the form of a question, do you mean that the entity which we all call soul is precisely that which is defined by the expression self-generating motion? And the Athenian concurs. Another way of expressing the point appears at Phaedrus 245c to e, where Socrates applies the logic of motion to conclude, as he says, that every soul is immortal. That is because whatever is always in motion is immortal, while what moves and is moved by something else stops living when it stops moving. So it is only what moves itself that never desists from motion, since it does not leave off being itself. In fact, this self-mover is also the source and spring of motion in everything else that moves, and a source has no beginning. That's because anything that has a beginning comes from some source, but there is no source for this, since the source that got its start from something else would no longer be the source. And since it cannot have a beginning, then necessarily it cannot be destroyed. That is because if a source were destroyed, it could never get started again from anything else, and nothing else could get started from it. That is, if everything gets started from a source. This, then, is why a self-mover is a source of motion, and that is incapable of being destroyed or starting up. Otherwise, all heaven and everything that has been started up would collapse, come to a stop, and never have cause to start moving again. But since we have found that a self-mover is immortal, we should have no qualms about declaring that this is the very essence and principle of a soul, for every bodily object that is moved from outside has no soul, while a body whose motion comes from within, from itself, does have a soul, that being the nature of a soul. And if this is so, that whatever moves itself is essentially a soul, then it follows necessarily that soul should have neither birth nor death. Motion, as it's defined at 181c in Plato's Theaetetus, is change in either spatial position or in state, so that a change in the state of mind is also motion. At 80a in the Phaedo, Socrates gives us some logic for the soul and its initiation of motion. As he awaits calmly the injustice of his execution, Socrates states, look at it also this way. When the soul and the body are together, nature orders the one to be subject and to be ruled, and the other to rule and be master. Socrates' point is that it's not the body that rules the mind, rather it's the soul that rules the motions of the physical thing, which is the body. As intelligent actors, I think we can be grateful that the mind rules the physical body. Motion and change are principal themes of the Theaetetus, in which Socrates addresses the soul's source of knowledge and intelligence. At 153c, he asks, and what about the condition of the soul? Isn't it by learning and study, which are motions, that the soul gains knowledge and is preserved and becomes a better thing? Whereas in a state of rest, that is, when it will not study or learn, it not only fails to acquire knowledge but forgets what it has already learned. Later in the dialogue, Socrates and Theaetetus discuss how the soul derives knowledge and intelligence by comparison of opposites in the qualities of things, such as by judging the distinction between good and bad things, beautiful and ugly things, hard and soft things, like and unlike things, and so forth. No soul, no intelligence, and no algorithm programmed by any soul has direct contact with the universal, changeless, timeless truths of things like goodness, badness, beauty and ugliness, hardness and softness, likeness and unlikeness. The reason for our inability to measure such timelessness, such absoluteness, is a crucial point for understanding Plato's conception of the soul and the physical universe that the soul created and continues to create. The Platonic universe consists of two realms, one of which is timeless and not physical, and the other of which is a physical realm that we experience in time. Scientists obtain empirical evidence from the continuous motion of change in the physical realm, but the second law of thermodynamics guarantees that physical things can exist only for limited times. However, the true forms of physical states like hardness and softness, which are the timeless measures by which our minds gauge the changing states of physical things in time, are unchanging. To exist as truths for all times, the forms cannot be subject to the changes of physical motion in time. The forms of truth exist only in the timeless, unchanging realm of being, for which we can never have empirical evidence because it contains nothing physical. Our minds and souls are not physical objects, whereas our bodies and all other physical things are part of the continuously changing realm of becoming. Becoming is the constant state of change of anything physical, which is why Socrates observes at Theaetetus 152d that, quote, nothing ever is, but everything is coming to be, unquote. Scientists agree that according to the second law of thermodynamics, every physical thing comes to be, at one time, in a state of maximum order, and over time comes to be in a state of maximum disorder. The state of becoming is the state of entropy, which I mentioned earlier, and entropy applies only to the physical order of change. Whereas our souls and minds are limited in time by the physical body, operation of our souls and minds over time is not limited by entropy. Entropy restricts the order of change among physical things, whereas there's no restriction on the ability of the human soul and mind to change state whenever self-motivation chooses. Exemption from entropy is the power of the soul and mind in the realm of being to exercise the faculty of reason, which is not a physical process, to observe the logic of change in the order of physical causes and effects. In its self-generating motions over time, a soul has the capacity to gather greater amounts of intelligence by application of reason in measuring the order of causes and effects in motion. This is a very different process from what we call machine learning and artificial intelligence, because machines are incapable of generating their own motion and rely instead on programmed inputs and processes to generate their algorithmic outputs without reference to the eternal realm of being. Perception that's limited to the continuous motion and change in the physical realm of becoming, like the perceptions of a machine's sensors or our five physical senses, is therefore not the same thing as knowledge and intelligence, which are developed in the realm of being. At Theaetetus 186e, after examining the limitations of physical perception, Socrates concludes that perception, quote, has no share in the grasping of truth, since it has none in the grasping of being, unquote. Truth is not obtained from perception of motion, but instead from the exercise of reason about the causes and effects of motion, which leads Socrates to state that, quote, perception and knowledge could never be the same thing, unquote. So, unless we can refute Socrates, unless we can somehow demonstrate that reasoning is a process that's limited to physics and physical sensors, so that reason can be coded in an algorithm and operate in computer circuits without connection to the timeless forms of truth in the realm of being, then how is it possible that a machine could develop intelligence? There's an important piece of knowledge and source of intelligence that the soul is born with, according to Socrates in the Phaedo, which is knowledge of what he calls the equal. The logic for this conclusion begins to emerge at Phaedo 71a, where Socrates and the character Cebes observe that everything comes to be as opposites from opposites. For example, weaker exists because of strength, the slower comes from the swifter, injustice from justice, and so on. I think we can see the logic in this, that if there were no such thing as weakness, we would have no measure by which to gauge strength. Using this logic at 72a, Socrates concludes that it is agreed between us then that the living come from the dead in this way no less than the dead from the living. And if that is so, it seems to be sufficient proof that the souls of the dead must be somewhere whence they can come back again. Consider in this way, Cebes, that, as I think, we were not wrong to agree. If the two processes of becoming did not always balance each other as if they were going round in a circle, but generation proceeded from one point to its opposite in a straight line and it did not turn back again to the other opposite or take any turning, do you realize that all things would ultimately be in the same state, be affected in the same way, and cease to become? In this, Socrates is asserting that intelligence is in a continuous state of generation and never static in the way that, for example, knowledge of a particular moment in time would be embedded in an algorithm's design. Rather, Socrates is saying that knowledge is found at the point of circular balance where opposites are equal. That's the point in the middle where the soul applies reason and knowledge of the equal to differentiate between opposites. At 73a, Socrates asks, Do we not also agree that when knowledge comes to mind in this way, it is recollection? What way do I mean? Like this. When a man sees or hears, or in some other way perceives one thing, and not only knows that thing, but also thinks of another thing of which the knowledge is not the same, but different, are we not right to say that he recollects the second things that come into his mind? But, Socrates asks, from where does the soul derive knowledge of the equal if we're not born with it? At 75a, he asserts, we must then possess knowledge of the equal before that time when we first saw the equal objects, and realize that all these objects strive to be like the equal, but are deficient in this. In other words, we can't obtain knowledge of the equal itself by simply observing differences among many opposites. One would have to observe every opposite of opposites, which would be an impossible task, to establish the single equality among all of them, the one and only thing that we could call the equal. In Plato's Sophists, the visitor from Elea emphasizes the 5 key forms in eternal being by which we gain knowledge from motion. In finding the equal, we must have knowledge of the form of that which is, the forms of the same and the different, and the forms of change and rest. Developing such knowledge is, as the visitor states, a dialectical process between reasoning humans. Sophists, who treat knowledge as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, do not obtain knowledge by dialectic, nor do algorithms for seemingly knowledgeable commercial products like the now popular ChatGPT. In the Sophist at 254a, the visitor observes that instead of engaging in dialectic to search for the form of that which is, quote, the sophist runs off into the darkness of that which is not, which he's had practice dealing with, and he's hard to see because the place is so dark. But the philosopher always uses reasoning to stay near the form, being. He isn't at all easy to see because that area is so bright and the eyes of most people's souls can't bear to look at what's divine. In the Theaetetus, the sophist Protagoras is held as an example of a person who thinks that he knows the source and nature of all things, and who therefore holds his knowledge to be a valuable commodity available to the highest bidder. Early in the dialogue at 171a to c, Socrates presents the logical fallacy in the presumption of Protagoras that a human such as he can be the measure of all things. By that same presumption, Protagoras would have to admit that those people who think him wrong are in fact correct, since his human detractors are equally capable of being the measure of all things. Knowledge, as Socrates stated, is obtained at the conjunction of opposites that form 2 halves of a circle. Since a circle's measurement involves pi, with its never-ending decimals, mathematics and physics can't pinpoint the spot. The conjunction of opposites is, however, identifiable in the process of dialectic, in which reasoning humans continuously build knowledge by exchanging individual experiences of motion. If we think that any human or an algorithm, rather than dialectic, can provide the measure of all things, we can be led to believe that particularly persuasive sophists, or for that matter, sophistic algorithms like ChatGPT, are in possession of unquestionable knowledge. In a dialectic between reasoning humans and a free exchange of knowledge, we can discover different and better paths for building intelligence beyond the one and only path that the sophist prescribes. With their use of technological platforms, modern sophists, whether they claim political or spiritual or any other type of unquestionable knowledge, have gained huge followings, and their conflicting prescriptions for knowledge and action have led to global discord and existential risk for humanity. Gaining knowledge and intelligence is not an instantaneous programmable process. In the Republic, Socrates presents knowledge as a line that's divided into 2 unequal sections, with each section consisting of 2 divisions. Advancing knowledge from the first division in the first section to the 4th division in the second section requires the exercise of reason and measurement of ratios between the differing degrees of knowledge among the line's sections and divisions. Only by exercising reason and gauging ratios among the divisions of the line can we learn to distinguish between things that are continually changing in the physical realm of becoming and the changeless forms of those things in the realm of being. At the Republic 509d, Socrates explains that the first section of the divided line of knowledge consists of sensory images of physical things undergoing continuous motion and change. The second section of the line consists of what Socrates calls the originals of the physical things, and the originals are changeless only in the realm of being, accessible only to the soul and mind. In the first section of the divided line, where everything exists in continual motion, we have no basis for measurement of a thing's true, timeless, and unchanging characteristics. Perceiving only motion and change, in the line's first section, we're forced to hypothesize without knowing the thing's first principles, which limits us to belief and opinion. When the mind applies reason in the second section of the line, it does so by locating the thing's first principles, which are the source and cause that provide greater knowledge of the thing. In the line's second division, where the mind tests its hypotheses about a changing thing against the timeless nature of the thing, opinion becomes a thing of the past, and intelligence begins to develop in the third division of the line. In the line's final division, which is reached when the mind locates the equal using the knowledge with which the soul was born, knowledge and intelligence are achieved. It's the role of reason in the realm of being to guide us from unsubstantiated belief and opinion to the ultimate stages of the divided line of knowledge. The faculty of reason leads us to the first principles in knowledge of cause and effect. As Socrates states so succinctly at 98a in the Meno, for true opinions, as long as they remain, are a fine thing, and all they do is good, but they are not willing to remain long, and they escape from a man's mind, so that they are not worth much until one ties them down by an account of the reasons why. Progressing on the divided line of knowledge is a vastly different and far more complex process for creating the account of the reasons why than any algorithm could achieve, because algorithms lack experience of motion and have no ability to perceive the equal. The equal exists exclusively in the realm of being, where no physical thing, much less an algorithm, can exist. To dwell in the first section of the divided line of knowledge, which is the section of images and illusions, is to be like the prisoner in the cave in Plato's famous allegory that begins at 514a of the Republic. In the allegory, the prisoner is unable to do anything except look at moving images and shadows cast onto the two dimensions of the cave wall by the torchlight of men he does not know exist, who are standing on a parapet behind him. Having no understanding of the first principles of those images, namely their source and cause, the prisoner believes the images are real. For the prisoner, there is no realm of being, just the ever-changing realm of becoming, and in many ways the allegory applies no less to the images cast on our two-dimensional computer and phone screens from sources often unknown. With powerful generative AI technology, like ChatGPT, algorithms are increasingly capable of casting lifelike images onto our screens and convincing viewers to react to the falsehood of things that lack first principles. In fact, so many victims have been lured into believing some algorithmic falsehoods of artificial intelligence that there's now a term for the phenomenon. It's called AI psychosis. I'll conclude this episode with reference to the Parmenides, which is perhaps Plato's most enigmatic dialogue, with many theories still circulating about its fundamental meaning. The dialogue is primarily between the great philosopher Parmenides and a much younger Socrates on the subject of things that exist, and the question of whether existing things are one, as Parmenides holds, or not many, as the philosopher Zeno describes things. The difference is subtle, but as Socrates and Parmenides probe the question, a number of lengthy arguments are advanced for how we obtain knowledge of things that are. At 131b to c, Parmenides gives Socrates reason to reconsider a particular argument, saying, "Socrates, how neatly you make one and the same thing be in many places at the same time. It's as if you were to cover many people with a sail, and then say that one thing as a whole is over many." He then asks Socrates, in that case, would the sail be, as a whole, over each person, or would a part of it be over one person and another part over another? When Socrates responds that the sail exists in parts over many people, Parmenides asks him to consider the illogical implication, which would be that the timeless forms are themselves divisible and changeable, analogous to the one sail that Socrates thought was no longer one but many. In the dialogue's conclusion, the question of whether things are one, as Parmenides held, or not many, as Zeno stated, remains unanswered. What Socrates and Parmenides do agree on, from their dialectic, is that if the things that exist are not rooted in one thing, then it would be impossible to judge opposites such as like and unlike, same and different, and change and rest. It would therefore be impossible to locate the equal among the opposites. In his final words, Parmenides states that, quote, "If the one is not, then nothing is." Well then, what is the one in the concluding words of Parmenides? In suggesting an answer to the question, I'll return to Plato's revolutionary conception of the soul, and by extension the soul's mind, as the one source and cause of all things. In saying that everything is rooted in one thing, Parmenides rejects the notion that many particles of matter emerge first in the universe, with the soul following much later. Plato's dialogues, the Parmenides, the Republic, the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, the Meno, the Timaeus, the Theaetetus, the Laws, the Philebus, and the Sophist, lead to the conclusion that reasoning humans can have excellent knowledge of cause and effect of physical things and their continual motion and changes, and that such intelligence is obtained in the most complete form possible only by the mind and nothing else. Intelligence cannot exist artificially. Intelligence cannot be programmed. It is impossible to confine the soul in a lifeless thing like a machine or algorithm, because the soul is alive. The soul is the source of everything, including intelligence, in the living universe. The soul is the universe, and the body is the living vehicle for the soul's self-generating motion and intelligence. These are the messages from Plato's works from 2,400 years ago, and they're especially empowering for human intelligence in relation to the powerful technology that we're developing. Large technology companies cannot possibly create and sell an intelligence, much less one that's smarter and wiser than human intelligence gained from motion. The empowering message in Plato's works is that with intelligence and wisdom, humans can find the way to a very bright future with the creativity and the power of the soul that's in us. All that's needed to put us on that bright path is a change in our mindset toward technology and intelligence. Fortunately, a change in mindset requires no complex scientific knowledge and is within the reach of every one of us. A change of mindset can be accomplished by acknowledging that the problems and mistakes of the past cannot be undone, and by opening our minds to the true, the good, and the beautiful probabilities of the future that human intelligence is fully capable of achieving. The soul of the universe, which is in us, guarantees our potential and leaves to us the intelligence and freedom of choice to make the best of time.